Okay, everyone, thanks for coming down today. So before we get started, I've got a little disclaimer from the City of St. Louis Park that I am supposed to read before we get started. So the City of St. Louis Park has regulations about the height of what you can grow in your yard. Essentially, if you're going to grow plants that are taller than 6 inches in more than 25% of your yard, you'll need a permit. More information is available at the registration table. Okay, so with that, I always like to start with a little information about myself, get a little, so that you can have some background about my perspective and maybe a little perspective about this presentation going forward. So my name is James Wolfin, and I'm currently a master's student at the University of Minnesota, where I'm co-advised by Dr. Marla Spivak, who's in the Bee Lab in the Department of Entomology, and Dr. Eric Watkins in the Department of Horticulture doing turfgrass science. So these are kind of two worlds of research that are normally isolated from one another. But with my project, we're trying to see how we could bring bee forage back to a, well, not back to, how we could introduce bee forage to a grassland habitat. So that's one of the topics that I'll be talking about today. But in a broader sense, it's just kind of, turfgrass has been managed in one way for so long. And the greater idea is how can we rethink about how we manage turfgrass for greater ecological purposes. I'm not originally from Minnesota. I'm from New York, where we do have winter. I'm just not used to winter in mid-April, so thanks for that, I guess. Okay, so with that, I'll just jump into the presentation. So this presentation was developed in partnership with a lot of really great people. So Sam Bauer and myself represent the University of Minnesota on this end. I do primarily the bee work. I do have some background in turfgrass science, but it's really Sam Bauer who gives me so much help in regards to turfgrass science and all of the yard management practices, ideas, philosophies that go into this presentation. Bob Dahm, or Organic Bob, if some of you know him, he's really an expert in soil sciences, and some of his work and ideas are in this presentation. Douglas Owens-Pike from Energyscapes, and of course, Anna Bierbauer and John Bly from Metro Blooms are all partners who helped with this presentation. So our challenges, the challenges that we're looking to overcome in our yards. Firstly, the EPA defines runoff as the #1 threat to water quality for our lakes and streams. The second is native pollinators and honeybees are threatened by a lack of habitat, pesticides, and climate change. And what we want to do is we want to address these challenges within the context of our own yards. So the vision of Blue Thumb is to create beautiful and ecologically functioning landscapes in cities, towns, and suburbs that, one, protect clean water by minimizing runoff, and two, support thriving ecosystems, particularly through bees and our pollinators. So why find turf alternatives? So it's very important to understand that turfgrass has its place and it can be useful. There are some benefits that can be found in properly managed turfgrass lawns, particularly low input turfgrass lawns, and I'll expand on that later, but it does tend to have its drawbacks. And these drawbacks are generally in the form of inputs. So when I talk about inputs, I'm generally talking about fertilizing, irrigation, and water use. Fertilizer, irrigation, and mowing. So fertilizing, when we're putting these nutrients into our lawn, we also create the potential for these nutrients to be washed off by rainwater, stormwater, and into our valleys, streams, lakes, etc., and create a situation where there are algal blooms. So these algal blooms tend to suck up a lot of the oxygen that's normally available to whatever life forms are in our valleys, streams, etc., and they could really damage the water quality because of that. Water conservation is really becoming a hot button issue right now. We already see this becoming an issue in more arid states like in California, but this is really something that we should start be thinking about from at least as a national issue, possibly as a global issue. So when we can, we want to minimize our water input and minimizing our irrigation, especially here in Minnesota where we're fortunate to have so much natural rainfall. It's really something that we would like to be thinking about. And finally, expending precious fossil fuels. So each time we mow, unless you're using a push mower, we're releasing these fossil fuels, these potentially noxious gases, and if we use turf species or just any practices that can reduce the amount of mowing that occurs in our yard, we can reduce how many fossil fuels we're using ourselves. So it's also important to understand the state of turfgrass in the United States. So turfgrass alone covers 50,000 square miles in the continental US, making up about 2% of the entire continental United States. And while we tend to think of this as sort of maybe not just the most numerous thing that we see, in terms of acreage, it's the most land-consuming crop by more than 3 times what we see for irrigated corn. And it's most common in suburbs and urban areas. So while we might generally think of, New York in terms of big cities and suburbs, or Los Angeles, big cities with huge suburbs, if you look at Minnesota, that big patch of green where Minneapolis and St. Paul is represents an area of high turfgrass prevalence. So these issues that we're going to talk about today, it really hits home with Minneapolis and Minneapolis homeowners, or all Twin Cities homeowners, rather. So first, what I'm going to do is give an overview of this workshop and talk about where we can install turf alternatives and the locations within our yard we should consider these alternatives. So I'll talk about the different, limiting factors that we all might see within our yards and how we can go about installing turf alternatives in the face of these limiting factors. So where are these turf alternatives appropriate? So some things that you want to be asking yourself as I discuss this is, what locations make sense for me as a homeowner or land manager, and what are the different conditions I need to consider? So some places where we're trying to target at Metro Blooms are boulevards. So Metro Blooms has this program called Blooming Boulevards, where they take a boulevard, which is also known as a health strip, and they're trying to remove the grass and instead install some form of perennial plant cover, some form of flowering species that can provide forage for pollinators and reduce the amount of input we need to throw into our yards. As many landowners know, it can be very difficult to install turf grass in a slopey area, and this is another area that is targeted for this kind of alternative lawn care. Right-of-ways, I'm sure as many of you drive across highways or major roads, you start to notice an increasing kind of over time abundance of wildflowers. So these areas used to be managed with your typical Kentucky bluegrass turfs that are managed for aesthetics, but more and more we're starting to see low-input turf grasses and flowering plants in right-of-ways. And naturalized areas where we have turf grass, these are systems where, even though there's not too many naturalized areas left in Minnesota, fewer than 1% of the prairies that used to exist in Minnesota are still here today. But in these areas, we want to do everything that we can to make sure that there's flowering plants for our pollinators, and really just any native species that is dependent on native flowers, plants, etc. So some things to consider within your own landscape. 1 is traffic and use, 2, soil and drainage, 3, sun and shade. And I'll expand on these as we go throughout our presentation. So you want to be thinking about how your lawn is used. Is it somewhere where you have high foot traffic? Maybe you have several kids or grandkids that use it continuously, a dog that's running through your yard. The level of foot traffic that you have is going to ultimately dictate how you use your yard and kind of help you as you make that decision. Is this a surface for human function, or is this a surface for ecological function? And also, does your boulevard receive winter salt from the road? So salt can be something that certain turf grass species struggle with, and certain plant species as well struggle with. So if you do receive lots of winter salt, it can dictate the types of plants that survive in these areas. So as you're considering what plantings work for you as a homeowner, these are 2 ideas that you want to take into account: land use and salt. So whenever you're thinking about plants and what kind of plants will be able to survive, you also want to think about the soil that you have. So here I'm presenting 2 very basic soil types, when in reality there's a whole spectrum of soils that exist, but I just want to use this as a clear example. If anyone wants more information on the soil type they have, I would personally say there's no better way to spend $20. It's so inexpensive, and the amount of information that you receive is unbelievable. So getting a soil test is something I would definitely recommend for all homeowners looking to get new plantings.
Where do you get this?
So I know that the university Soil Sciences Lab offers it for right around $20, but I'm sure there's other places that do it as well. I'd imagine your county extension agent would have plenty of information on that, but I know that the U of M does it as a fallback. So anyway, just 2 basic soil types. So when we think about sand, we're probably thinking about being at the beach and you probably associate those particles as being very small. But within the context of soil science, sandy grains are actually the largest soil particles that you see. And because there's large soil particles, there's a lot of potential for water to move through this soil type. So in that top layer of the soil bed, where you're going to potentially have root growth, you're not having as much water retained. So this isn't to say that you can't have plants grow in a sandy soil, but it's something that you want to be weary of as a landowner, and you want to make sure that you're buying plants that are well adapted to sandy soil sites. On the other hand, in a loam soil or even a clay soil to an extent, we have these really fine particles that hold much more water. So because water is no longer a limiting factor, there's really a much wider plethora of plants that can be retained. So granted, there's other factors like organic matter content and the microbial communities within the soil that you also want to be thinking of, but these are just a couple quick hitters on why you should be thinking about your soil and how it can dictate the plants that you put into your own yard. So I mentioned clay, and in most instances, clay should not be an issue for growing plants, but when you have really heavy clay, there are some issues that can be presented. So some clay, when it's very heavy, it won't retain as much organic matter, and it also won't retain as much water. So it's just kind of further reasoning as to why you want to make sure you know what kind of soil you have in your own yard. You also want to be conscious of the light that exists in your yard. So when people tell me that they're having trouble getting plants to establish in their yard, or a really great example of this is, I swear I've never seen so many mild Minnesotans get really, really aggressive as when I bring up Creeping Charlie. So from that reaction, I'm going to guess that some of you have faced that problem yourself. And the reason that some plants struggle in a shady condition and that Creeping Charlie thrives is because of different plants are adapted to different levels of light. So if you have an area where nothing can grow because there's so much shade, you really want to consider plants that are well adapted for shade tolerance. And unfortunately, if you have a situation where you don't have a shade-adapted plant and instead you have a yard covered in Creeping Charlie, that's because Creeping Charlie thrives in this situation where there's very limited light and there's lots of moisture. That's kind of a breeding zone for Creeping Charlie. So that's not the focal point of this talk today, but it's kind of just gives you some insight as to the importance that light could have in your yard. So moving on to plants that aren't Creeping Charlie, things that will maybe change the emotional state of this room. Pathrush is a type of grass, so not necessarily the turf grasses that we generally see in Minnesota, but kind of an alternative ground cover that's used in shadier areas in the south, but can also thrive in shady areas here. And it also doesn't grow quite as fast as our typical turf grass species, so you can manage it as a no-mow area when there is some sunlight. So in shady conditions, you can also consider some violets. So in the foreground of this picture, those plants with the kind of a teardrop-shaped vegetation, those are some violets that do really well in shady settings. So in sunny and dry conditions, there's a whole nother set of plants. And this really just drives in the point that as you're thinking about what plants grow, shade, light is something you really want to be thinking about. So make sure that you're having plants that are well adapted to the amount of light that you receive in your yard or whatever land it is that you're managing. So next, what to install. So we're kind of going to go through 3 different options, moving from the most human-friendly to the most eco-friendly. And depending on how you use your yard and kind of what your ideal design is, what your ideal lawn is, will dictate which option is the best for you as a homeowner. So I'll talk about low-maintenance turf, pollinator-friendly lawns, and perennial ground cover options. So when you think about low-maintenance turf and really any of these options, you want to think, do you want the typical lawn appearance, or are you okay deviating slightly away from that in order to obtain some ecological benefits? And also, once again, how heavily do you use your lawn? So if you really use your lawn a lot, you want to stick with either these low-maintenance turfs or maybe a more traditional turf grass. But if you're okay as having your lawn as kind of a hub for ecological function rather than a human play area, then it's some of those more eco-friendly options that we're going to present that might be a great option for you. So I've used low input or low maintenance a lot, and it's important to really drive in what those characteristics are. So drought tolerance, or how much water a plant species needs. The rate of growth, which ties directly to mowing. So a slow vertical growth rate will mean less mows per summer or per growing season. And whether you care about your ecosystems or not, I'm sure we all want to mow less. And also fertility needs. So I mentioned that runoff can carry nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. We really want to keep those out of our water systems. So if we can choose turf grasses that don't require as much fertilizer, we can really do some good for our local ecosystems. So from a turf grass science perspective, we're also occasionally thinking about disease resistance and insect resistance, but that really won't be the focus of what I'm talking about today. So the environmental benefits of a low maintenance lawn. So some qualities that I've already mentioned already. So preventing soil erosion and stabilizing dust. But the two that I really like to focus on are the release of oxygen and carbon sequestration. So right now, with climate change being a real hot button issue, especially the amount of carbon dioxide that exists, it's important that we have as much green cover as possible to take that atmospheric carbon dioxide and bring it back to usable oxygen. In many suburban and urban areas, the largest green space that exists is turf grass in the home lawn, turf grass in parks, or turf grass at a golf course. So it's really important that we manage these areas as best we can to maximize the amount of green cover to take that carbon dioxide and convert it into usable oxygen. Secondly, we also want to be thinking about carbon sequestration. So this is something that is really applicable to turf grass as well as the other plants. But what these plants can do is take that atmospheric carbon and bring it back into our soils, where all life forms, so we're all carbon-based life forms, from the smallest arthropod and insect to anything that you'll find in the Twin Cities for sure. We're all carbon-based, so we all need that carbon in our diets. So the more we can take that atmospheric carbon, bring it back into our soil systems, you kind of have a nutrient cycling that's really beneficial. So when it comes to the low-maintenance lawn, the gold medal species, especially here in a cold northern climate, is the fine fescues. So the fine fescues is kind of an umbrella term. There's several species that are considered a fine fescue grass. And the reason that we recommend these grasses in the north is because they have all of those low-maintenance characteristics we talked about. So fine fescue relative to Kentucky bluegrass is super low fertility. It requires 1/6 the fertilizer on an annual basis relative to the typical Kentucky bluegrass variety. It's very slow growing, so there will be some images to come. But at the University of Minnesota Bee Lab, we get away with mowing our fine fescue lawn twice per growing season. So it's something that we're really proud of, both in terms of kind of reducing the amount of mowing to reduce fossil fuel output, and also the kind of plants that are able to grow within a fine fescue lawn. It's also very winter hardy, which, as we see since it's still winter in the middle of April, is a very valuable feature. The only negatives that we really see are that it has poor traffic tolerance. So if you do have a dog or pets running through the yard where abrasion, so scratching of the grass, can be an issue, you may want to avoid fine fescue or possibly mix it with another fescue option. So I know most grass seed carriers around here carry both a fine fescue mix or a general fescue mix. So that would be fine fescue mixed with tall fescue. Both are low input grasses, and this kind of moves from a societal issue to a lawn-specific issue. So they have different limiting factors. So in areas of your lawn where the limiting factor is wear damage, the fine fescues will struggle and the tall fescues will do really well. In the areas of your lawn where the limiting factor is sun and shade, the tall fescues don't do quite as well, but the fine fescues will thrive. So now we're kind of moving from societal issues to a lawn-by-lawn basis as to what should I put into my yard. So these
I saw that snow mold. What is that?
Yeah, so snow mold is an issue that it won't really affect so much whether your lawn survives throughout the season. What it does is it will cause some discoloration in the early season for grass. So typically this time of year is when you would see some snow mold damage. Because this winter has been super long, So something that I do because, knowing plant cycles is super important to me in my work, is I keep track of degree days. We're about 400 degree days behind last year. It depends on which calculation you go by, but we're way behind last year, so we're probably still a couple weeks away from seeing snow mold damage. But if aesthetics are something that you really value, then snow mold damage could be bothersome to you. But once we get those more typical growing temperatures, where we're averaging like 50 to 60 degree day air temperature, then snow mold isn't going to be an issue. Those grasses that were struggling with snow mold will green right up and your lawn will be fine. Yeah, so no-mow mixtures. So we have a grass species that's already slow growing, and the plant breeders, the turfgrass science plant breeders, really wanted to take advantage of that. So what they did was they bred specifically for this slow growing characteristic, such that the grass only needs to be cut once to twice per year. So I know that labeling it as no-mow might be a little bit of a stretch because you still do have some mowing required, but significantly reducing the amount of mowing needed is really, really useful. And part of what makes this possible is the way that fine fescue grows as a grass. So if you think of your typical Kentucky bluegrass lawn or perennial ryegrass lawn, it has this tendency to grow straight up vertically, whether it's at 2 inches, 4 inches, 6 inches, however long you let it grow. With fine fescue, it's got this really neat growth habit where once it hits about 5 or so inches, it'll start to lay over itself. So it does vary from city ordinance to city ordinance whether this is permissible, but if you're fine with that kind of layover aesthetic, then it can really help to reduce how frequently you're mowing your lawn. So this picture is right outside of Alderman Hall at the University of Minnesota. And these here are outside other, so on your right is another picture from the St. Paul campus. And on the left, I believe it's a picture that Metro Blooms took. I'm not sure where, but I think it was nearby one of their blooming boulevards. So these are all fine fescue lawns that are kind of showcasing that layover feature for the growth habit. So the fescues are more similar to Kentucky bluegrass, where it's that aesthetic that we're more used to, but with less input required. I also want to present some alternative options in the form of sedges and native grasses. So sedges are currently used by some landscape architects. These native grasses, there is some use, but right now they're a little more expensive and it's kind of experimental, but it's still good to have the knowledge. So there's a bunch of different sedge species that are used here in northern climates, from Pennsylvania sedge to fox sedge, ivory sedge, and plains oval sedge. And just as knowing the conditions in your yard was important with the type of turf grass that can grow, the same goes for sedge species, excuse me. So here we have Pennsylvania sedge, which is really well adapted to those sunny, dry conditions. So if you have a yard that receives full sun and you kind of are comfortable moving away from that traditional grass option to kind of a still grass-like, but something a little more low input, Pennsylvania sedge could be a really great option for you. Here it is again, kind of on a small hilly area where, as you can imagine, water retainment would be an issue, as a lot of that water would be taken away. But also, if you have a more shady area, there's plains oval sedge. So once again, there's many options available, and what you ultimately choose should be dependent on the conditions that you have within your yard. So prairie junegrass and the species under the genus Calaria are some species that the University of Minnesota Turfgrass Science Lab is working with. So most of the fescues that are used in our homes and parks are not native to the United States. What separates this grass from all other species, even a native species like the fine fescue grasses, is that not only is it native to North America, but it's super low input. So the mowing, the fertility, everything that we think about water needs is even less than that of the fine fescues. The issues that we see are with establishment. So when you drop down that fine fescue, the germination rate is super high. You have a lawn that's quickly covered with green grass. With Calaria, we're still working on breeding to get those germination rates high, to get that pure live seed higher. But it's important to know that as breeding efforts continue and this becomes more of an option for homeowners, this could be it has really great potential to be a low input option. So some other grass species that kind of fall under that same idea where they're native grasses that we still need to do some more breeding, some more research to figure out how to get them to grow in their lawn. But down the road, as these breeding efforts continue, they could be options are buffalo grass, tufted hairgrass, blue grama, western wheatgrass, and even side oats. So any time where establishment and germination is an issue, that's probably going to be correlated with high cost as well, because you're going to require more seed to get coverage. But hopefully, as breeding efforts continue, germination goes up, cost goes down, and they become an option for all of our homeowners. So option 2 is actually the project that I work on as a master's student. So this here is my bread and butter. There's very few things going on in science that I feel more passionate about than this project. So it's this idea of pollinator-friendly lawns and kind of completely redesigning the home lawn from, hundreds of years of treatment. So here there's kind of, we're building on the same questions we were considering before, where we're still considering the aesthetic. Are we okay with deviating from that picture-perfect lawn? How much land use do I have? And also, are you comfortable bringing life back to your yard, bringing pollinators back to your yard, and kind of shifting that balance a little bit further away from human-focused in favor of pollinator ecosystem function? So ultimately, what I want to do is redesign the turf lawn. And in your typical lawn, as you see on your left, it's either a monoculture or just a mixture of grass species. You're kind of devoid of life in terms of turf grass, in terms of low-growing species. What I hope to do is I'm trying to find low-growing flowers that can grow in conjunction with turf grass. So kind of build this matrix of turf grass and flowers where we kind of have a balance of human function. You could still walk through your lawn, have a picnic, play some games, but you can also provide high-quality forage for your pollinators. So thinking about the function of a bee lawn. So because of the turf species that work for this, particularly the fine fescues, we're able to keep that low maintenance, that low input character that's so valuable in current turf grass science efforts. So we're still minimizing mowing, watering, weeding, and fertilizing, because in terms of mowing, watering, and fertilizing, we're still using fine fescue, which is super low input for each of those 3 aspects. And when it comes to weeding, rather than looking at a flower and viewing it as something we want to take out of the lawn, now we're actively trying to promote these within our lawn and viewing them as food for our pollinators rather than an eyesore, I guess, to some. And also maintaining aesthetics and function. So we're really restricting these plantings to low-growing flowers. In my research, we're trying to target plants that bloom at as low as 2.5 inches so that we kind of maintain this aesthetic that's more common to what homeowners are used to, and avoiding taller plants that, would really limit the function in a yard. And when we're thinking about bringing back pollinators, I really want to make sure that everyone understands the benefits that go along with protecting our pollinators. So a recent study just last year out of the Chicago, Illinois area found that converting just as little as 5% of a lawn area, of a turf grass area, to pollinator-friendly habitat could improve pollination in both urban gardens and urban farms. So these are both things that are becoming much more common in urban and suburban landscapes. So if you do some gardening yourself or you want to help out your local urban gardeners and farmers, bring back your pollinators can help to improve their yields and kind of help drive local food, a lot of practices that we really want to see brought back. So when we think about the floral species that work within a bee lawn, there are 3 main characteristics that I look for. First, they have to be able to establish in Minnesota soils. So I'm trying floral species I try to stick with natives, but when you're trying to get a plant established, sometimes you just have to take whatever can grow. And you want to make sure that they're able to establish where you are. Next, and this is kind of the tricky one, is they have to be able to survive mowing practices. So for most forms of vegetation, chopping off half of or 1/3 of the extent of the of its body with a lawnmower would be something that's extremely stressful, and the plant would struggle to grow back from that. So turfgrass has been bred for that, but most flowers haven't. So we want to target flowers that can not only survive a mowing event, but can continue to grow and bloom after being mowed. And finally, we want to choose only floral species that are known to be high-quality sources of forage for our bees. So when I say high-quality source of forage, I'm talking about the level of sugar in the nectar and the level of protein in the pollen, both things that bees need in order to grow, mature, and survive. And as I mentioned, we try to incorporate native flowers, but I will present some non-natives as well, and I hope that some information I provide about those flowers can kind of ease some concerns that you have about non-natives. So what I like to do here is I like to talk about each flower that I include in a bee lawn, not necessarily from the human perspective, but from the perspective of a bee. So with Self-Heal Prunella vulgaris, we have this really beautiful native flower, but we also have a flower that is just really great for our larger bees. So if you look at the little purple florets, you'll notice that they kind of have a long corolla, so a longer neck to that flower. And what that does is it really serves itself nicely to larger bees like bumblebees, megachilids, etc. And the reason for that is these larger bees tend to have longer tongues as well. So if you want to scoop out the nectar from a flower with a long corolla, you need to have that long tongue to reach in and grab it. So this flower is primarily a nectar source that does best in full to part sun. But what's another thing that's great about it is if you choose to plant it, it should bloom in the first year after seeding. And that's very rare for a flower. So creeping thyme kind of functions, from the bee's perspective at least, in the exact opposite way as the self-heal. So rather than having these kind of more enclosed blooms that lends itself to larger pollinators, it has these really small, wide open blooms. And even though we generally think of, when we think bees, we generally think maybe a bumblebee or a honeybee, there's hundreds and hundreds of bees in Minnesota, and most of them are much smaller than our honeybees and bumblebees. So if you want to conserve some ground nesting bees or sweat bees, having these small flowers where the nectar is openly available to them can be incredibly important. So in addition to its use for bees, we also need plants that can survive these harsh Minnesotan winters. So these creeping thyme flowers really are tough little Vikings. They are incredibly winter hardy and can survive even the harshest of winters like this one here. Yeah, I noticed a question in the back.
Yeah, are they invasive? So will it take over my neighbor's yard?
So creeping thyme is not an invasive species. In fact, so you know your horticulture, you know that this is a non-native. So what I'm going to do in probably within the next 5 minutes is I have a slide that talks about what a naturalized plant is and how that differs from an invasive plant. So I can so the answer that I'll leave it at for now is not all non-natives are invasive, and it's important to understand how a non-native plant behaves in the context of your lawn, specifically how it interacts with the plants that are native that we want to conserve. So I'll expand on that later, but I hope that kind of is a just definition for now. So this final little point kind of hits on my city boy upbringing. So in New York City, we didn't have too many deer strolling through the yards, but in talking to Minnesotan homeowners, I've found that that can be a real issue to homeowners, especially those with gardens where you want to have tomatoes or some garden vegetables growing. So if dealing with deer is an issue for you, thyme is kind of like a natural deterrent where deer really don't like the smell and taste of it. Mm-hmm. So creeping thyme, it actually does really well in the face of drought tolerance. It used to be thought of as a sandy soil adapted species, but some recent trials that me and another graduate student did at the University of Minnesota, we found that it can grow in a less shady, kind of more clay loamy soil, so the soil that most of the homeowners here will have. So even though it's typically thought of as a sandy, drought tolerant plant, it can grow in a variety of different yard types. So ground plum, and if we're talking about yards, this is a kind of a good section to deviate. So ground plum is most certainly a sandy adapted plant. So this is really something you should only be considering if you have a sandy soil in your yard, which is not too common, but it's not unheard of. And what's really great about ground plum is it's a legume and a nitrogen fixer. And what that means is we're taking atmospheric nitrogen, bringing it back into our soils, and reducing the amount of nitrogen we have to put in as fertilizer. So having legumes in our yard can help to reduce fertilizer use as well, which can help improve our waterways, streams, etc. So common violet is a flower that I don't do too much work with, but the partners at Blue Thumb do a lot of work with it. So although the vegetation is a little bit larger than the other plants I speak with, they found that it can still grow in conjunction with turfgrass species. And it also provides a beautiful variety of color to a yard as well. So this image here is a purple flower, but there's purple violets, there's white violets. And what's increasingly important from the bees' perspective is that bloom period. So I know it says April through June, and this April will be an exception because we're on to third or fourth winter, I don't know. But there's really this tendency where there's a dearth of early season flowers. So a common example of an early season flower is dandelion, which many homeowners don't like, but what these early season flowers do, like dandelion, like the violets, is when the pollinators are first stretching their wings, they need an instant source of nectar. They need an instant source of energy so that they can do the maintenance that's needed within their hive, with regards to provisioning their young. So getting them that early nectar fix is incredibly critical to the life cycle of a bee as it's coming out of its dormancy period. So Dutch white clover, which is another non-native flower, but for the research I've done, so from my undergrad through my graduate schooling, if there's one thing that I've learned, it's that Dutch white clover is an unbelievable flower. And if I am gonna die on a hill, it's this hill of it's this hill of trying to convince homeowners, anyone that I can get in front of, that Dutch white clover shouldn't be viewed as a weed. It should be viewed as a gold mine for our pollinators. So when I see someone spraying their clover, it really hurts me inside, because Dutch white clover, in my research, I found that it supports over 40 species of bees. When you consider that there's only about 425 species in Minnesota, and even fewer than that in the specific areas where I'm sampling, so my sampling is restricted to Minneapolis parks, the amount of diversity we see on this flower is absolutely astonishing. And about half of the bees that I see are honeybees. So whether you're worried about your local beekeepers and honeybee pollination, it's an incredible resource. If you're concerned about your native bees and trying to promote native insects in your yard and communities, it's an incredible resource. And part of that, building on just the visitors, is the quality of the nutrients. So it provides both pollen that's high in protein content and nectar that's high in sugar content. So I have a really strong background in honeybees, and I know that 25% of the pollen they bring back in their hive through the course of a year is from this little flower right here. So clover is unbelievably important. So I encourage you to, at a bare minimum, if you see clover, just let it be. And
Good for all soil types?
clover, oh gosh. So I would say it's more of an issue to keep it out of your yard than to try and get it into your yard. If you put it down, it will find a way. Clover is fantastic.
It's another nitrogen fixer.
You bet, that's right. That's the last little bullet point there. So another legume, another nitrogen fixer. So even if you're just concerned about the overall health of your lawn, clover can really help to do that. So I try not to go too deep on my little clover parade, but I hope I did a decent job of convincing you all that clover is something that's incredibly important to our ecosystems. So as mentioned by the question before, two of these flowers that I have mentioned are non-natives. So white clover, creeping thyme, these are two non-natives, but I want to give some opinions from experts in the field that are removed from myself, because obviously I have some bias, about the value of white clover and the value of other non-natives that are known to be naturalized. So the first is from Neil from the National Park Service. And what he says is that Dutch white clover has been in the US for a long time and is more or less naturalized. I generally don't see it outcompeting native species. And what he did within that quote is really just define the word naturalized. So what separates a naturalized plant from an invasive plant is whether or not it's displacing native species. So a non-native plant that is outcompeting natives and taking them away from our landscapes would be defined as invasive. A non-native plant that can coexist with natives is considered to be naturalized. And the second quote here is from the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, and what they say is, while non-native flowers may be aggressive, they can still be very useful. So Dutch white clover, Trifolium repens, and creeping thyme, Thymus staphylium, are two species that benefit pollinators and will flower within a mixed lawn. So here's another image of common violet in a naturalized lawn. And what you can see there is it's growing in conjunction with the turf grass. So as we try to keep that typical lawn aesthetic, and also we want to think about our neighbors or something that won't be an eyesore to our neighbors, this is really a great plant to consider within our yards. So now some other possible additions for pollinator-friendly lawns. So these are flowers that neither Metro Blooms nor myself have done, the full level of research that we would like to see. But with some of these flowers, I've done some preliminary studies, and with some of the flowers, Metro Blooms at least thinks they have potential. So I'll quickly run through the flowers. And I know I talk about flowers, and it's probably my favorite part, so I'll try and run through them a little bit quickly, but enough where you could still take notes. So Calico Aster is another one that I think is an incredible flower, at least in the potential that it can have within your lawns. So I know when I say clover, those of you that have some sort of a horticultural background are probably thinking of flowers that bloom at, I guesstimate, around 18 inches or so. And while Calico Aster can grow tall to heights of over a foot, when you cut it back to 3.5 inches, it'll still bloom. So in terms of the forage that it brings to pollinators, it's another one of these wide open flowers where small pollinators will visit it, large pollinators will visit as well, because those petals are nice landing pads for larger bees, and it provides both nectar and pollen. But what I think is really most exciting about this flower is if you look at those little disc florets in the center of the flower. So when you're a pollinator flying through yards, looking at different flowers, all of the characteristics of a flower that you think about when you make the decision, will I forage here or will I not forage here, are called pollinator syndromes. And one of those pollinator syndromes is the colors that you see. So research by Sam Droege at the USGS has found that the colors that bees tend to prefer are the blues and violets, the yellows, and the whites. And if you look at the disc florets, as well as the petals of this flower, you'll see all of those colors present. So as those disc florets change from the purple to the yellow, the yellow to the purple, it brings in different types of bees with different color preferences. And since the petals are naturally white, you're bringing in a huge diversity of bees with different color preferences. So Prairie Grounsell, so this is kind of a species where you have to be a little bit more relaxed or hands-off as a homeowner, and that's due to the height at which the plant grows. So now we're moving away from these low-growing species that bloom at 3.5 or so inches or less, and we're looking at a species that blooms at about a foot. However, when it's not in bloom, you have vegetation that can really meet the specs that we're looking for. So if you cut back that vegetation before and after bloom, we have something that's growing at about 3 inches for most of the year. And this is another option that's available for dry soil sites. So now we're going to move on to option 3, which is perennial ground cover. So when I started with alternative grass species or low input grasses like the fine fescues, these are really kind of that's the option that's going to be most familiar to a homeowner. You're really not changing too much within your yard. You're just going from grass type A to grass type B. It's pretty easy. The bee lawn is kind of a nice little midpoint where we're in the middle of what works for a human and what works for a pollinator. As we move to perennial ground cover, now we're thinking of something that's really going to move more in favor of our pollinators and kind of minimizing that human focus, but we're really trying to maximize our ecological impacts. So once again, we have some questions that we need to ask ourselves. How much traffic do I foresee in my lawn? So if you anticipate heavy traffic in your lawn, this really isn't going to be an option for you. How much time and resources do I have in my hands? So converting from a typical lawn to a perennial ground cover lawn is something that will take 2 to 3 growing seasons, depending on how much land it is that you manage. And also, am I okay with a non-traditional look? So a bee lawn and a low maintenance lawn is something that your neighbors really shouldn't notice or shouldn't mind too much. A perennial ground cover is a little bit more alternative. I guess that's a word I've been using a lot today. So there might be a little bit more brushback, but hopefully if the communities understand the ecological value of them, they'll be more accepting. So what we're essentially trying to do is create a micro meadow. How can we bring a prairie or a small meadow back to your yard? So here I'm going to go over a tight matrix of native grasses and flowers that can be used in conjunction with turf grass or as an alternative to turf grass. So this requires a complete replacement of your turf and does require some planning, some time, and some money to be invested. But what you're going to do is ultimately maximize that ecological impact. So a perennial ground cover. So as I've said, this offers the greatest ecological benefit, but is very location specific. So this is where you really need to do the most thinking about what conditions exist within the land that I manage. And I'm going to talk about all of the different types of lawn replacement, whether it's sod removal, mulching, etc. But you really want to make sure that you do some planning yourself. And even if you have the ability to, you want to contact a landscape designer or look at online tools, both of which are offered by Blue Thumb. So now I'll talk quickly about how to install these perennial ground covers. So we want to start by completely removing the existing plantings. So I'll talk about 4 different ways this can be done: sod removal, solarization, sheet mulching, and safe herbicides. So for each of these, I'm going to give a brief overview. If you want more information on them, Blue Thumb has a lot of great info, and I'll talk about some places where you can get more information. So sod removal is kind of the most straightforward, and I'm sure that many of you have some experience with this. You're going to use a sod kicker or a sod cutter to take out the existing turf, and then you can seed right over it. Unfortunately, while I make it sound easy standing up here in a podium in an air-conditioned room, it is way more difficult when you're out there with the sod cutter or the little spade removing the turf yourself. So here the drawback is the effort and the physical toll that it takes on your body. So at the UMN Turfgrass Lab, we have teams of God knows how many grad students, undergrad scientists doing this for our turf, and it's a full-day activity. So asking a homeowner to do it, that can be quite the bear. So it is an option, and there are land care companies that can do this for you, but it's either going to cost a lot in terms of effort or be possibly a little bit pricey. The next option is solarization. And what we see here is a thin sheet of plastic that goes over a small stretch of yard. So you can see here that we're not targeting the entirety of the turf grass at once. You want to do this in sections, because when you solarize, you are going to remove the entirety of the turf. And this is something that you want to do in sections, because if you have bare soil present for an extended period of time, then when it rains, when there's storm water, when there's water running through your lawn, a lot of that soil and the nutrients within it, the nitrogen, phosphorus, are going to be carried straight away into nearby lakes, rivers, etc. By keeping some of that lawn still present, you're going to capture some of those nutrients, some of that storm water, and minimize the ecological deficiencies while you're converting your lawn. So how solarization works is with that little plastic, that little piece of tarp, what it's going to do is it's going to collect heat throughout the duration of a growing season. So you put it down early, so within the next few weeks, once we start to generate some warmth, and you let it go for the duration of a growing season. It can vary a little bit depending on how much sun you receive in your yard and the area that you're trying to cover. But throughout the growing season, this land surface will collect heat, and it'll get warmer and warmer to the point where all vegetation underneath that sheet will be killed. And once this is done, when you remove that solarization blanket, you can remove all the vegetation and you can seed whatever you want. And that's because you'll have bare soil, which means that you won't have to worry about seed to soil contact. So in many instances, when you're trying to seed, especially as an overseeding, a limiting factor could be seed to soil contact. So This is something I'll talk about in a little bit, where a lot of your seed can be caught up in the grass or caught up in whatever vegetation is present. If you're seeding directly onto the soil bed, you have perfect seed-to-soil contact ratios, and germination should be far easier.
So,
Mhm.
is that something you do for the whole growing season, and then you leave it uncovered for the winter, and then have
Yeah,
the wet
yeah.
canvas in the spring?
So what I would recommend, and the Xerxes Society has a really great informational brochure document on this, is once that's removed, you would want to do your seedings as a dormant planting. So you plant when soil temperatures are right around 40 degrees, and the reason for that specific temperature is it's too cold for anything to germinate, and if it were to germinate once we start heading into winter, it would just immediately die. But it's not quite yet at the point where the ground is frozen. So it allows the seeds to hit the ground, but it's not, the ground isn't frozen and it's not going to germinate. So it just lays there dormant until we collect enough degree days in the summer where whatever you planted can start to grow.
Can I add something to that really quickly? This is something I did in my yard last year. I worked for Metro Blooms. I got antsy, and after about 6 weeks, took the black plastic off that I had laid down because there was nothing growing underneath it anymore, and it looked like bare dirt. The problem with not leaving it for the entire growing season is that you don't kill all of the weeds that are going to come up in the middle of summer or at the end of the summer. So we overseeded, and that worked great, but we got a ton of weeds in it, so it's best to leave it for the whole growing season.
Yeah, to build upon what Laura just said, it's kind of this idea that aesthetics and what we can see can sometimes be deceiving. So, I mean, we probably all know it from hand weeding, where you think you've killed the weed, you think you've gotten it out, but if you don't get all of the roots off, you don't completely kill the roots, that's just going to grow right back, and that's probably what you experienced yourself within your yard. So, so the Xerxes Society and their documents, they detail this far more than I do in a 1 to 2 minute slide, but it's a really great option that's super eco-friendly. Yes, another question?
Sorry. So is clear plastic or black plastic, does it matter?
So I've seen both done. I believe Metro Blooms, the one that you just did outside, I don't remember which church. I believe you used black plastic, is that correct?
We've always used black plastic. I think there's more heat that's trapped.
Yeah, it does absorb more heat, but I have seen it done with clear plastic as well. Okay, so sheet mulching. So as you can see, there are a lot of steps that go into this, and rather than bore you with lots of text, we're going to kind of go by this step by step to make it a little more digestible, something that we can consume and really see the value of. So step 1 of sheet mulching is quite simply cut her down. So this is kind of a common theme where if you don't want to get rid of all your turf grass, but you kind of want to change up what you have, that really low cut is super valuable. So you want to mow it short, and important, leave the clippings. So those clippings can recycle some important nutrients back into your lawn, and they're very valuable. So the exception to this is you do want to remove woody material. So larger woody materials, after you cut it down, you want to remove those. Next, you want to apply just a little bit of molasses. So a 1/4 cup of molasses mixed with 2 gallons of water is enough to cover 300 square feet of area. And this might be something where you're thinking, why am I putting molasses down in my yard? And the reason for that is, once again, kind of looks can be deceiving. So when we think about life, we have this tendency to think of macroinvertebrates, large-bodied organisms, and we tend to think less about smaller animals and even less microbial communities. So when we think about a food web, it really always starts at the bottom. So most people think herbivores feeding on plants, but it even goes deeper than that. So the microbial community is really the building blocks of any ecosystem, and molasses is like a superfood for your microbes. So even though you don't see them and maybe we don't fully understand their life processes, it's still very important to support them as they're kind of the building blocks for our local ecosystems. Next, we want to add compost, and it's important that we add high-quality compost. So somewhere between a 1/4 inch to a full inch of quality compost. And while it is generally available at big box stores, you do want to be very considerate as to the compost that you're buying. So I'll quickly cover 2 forms of compost, but whoever you're talking to at, whether it's the big box store, whether you're looking online, you really want to do some reading and some research to know about what you're buying. So cardboard, so putting something over the top of this compost. So I know we say cardboard, but it's probably very unlikely that anyone here right now has this much cardboard just lying around. So you want to use cardboard or a mixture of newspaper, 2 to 3 layers thick, and you really want to soak it so that it really stays in place, so that it really has some nice firm hold to it. After laying down your cardboard or newspaper or whatever you have access to, you want to add soil or compost 1 inch thick, and after this, your seeding can occur. So here, there's some seedings with crimson clover, oats, buckwheat. There's a number of different seedings that can be used. I'll go over a few of them, and I've already talked about a few, but it's just a good source. So next, you add some wood mulch, and what that does is it helps to hold water. So that wood mulch, it retains wetness and is really helpful as you're starting to have new plants established in your lawn, especially in a composted area. So the final option is, I know most of us, especially I imagine everyone here is thinking about how they can make their lives more green, how they can make their lawns more green, and you don't typically think of herbicides, but there are herbicides that are available. So acetic acid, usual citric acid, and the common theme is the specificity of the herbicide that you're using. So the negative connotation that exists among herbicides and chemicals and sprays is mostly with respect to these broad spectrum herbicides. So if you're using something like glyphosate, glyphosate will kill pretty much anything that it comes in contact with. What it doesn't kill is mostly species that have been bred to be resistant of it. So a farmer in a cornfield typically has Roundup-ready corn, so glyphosate-resistant corn. When you see marketing for Roundup-ready grasses, that means it's glyphosate-resistant. So now it's important, and we've already done this a little bit, to think about how we can repair and replenish our soils. So I'm going to talk about soil structure, some different compost sources, and some cover crops that can exist within these different soil types. So hydrophobic soil. So when we break down this word, there's 2 components to it. So hydro meaning water, and phobic, which means fear of. So when we think about a hydrophobic soil, we're thinking about a soil that does not interact well with water. So we can see here, when this soil is presented with water, it doesn't hold the moisture. It instead becomes, kind of muddy. And the potential harm in this is, 1, plants that we're trying to grow need this water. It's an incredibly valuable nutrient. And if a soil can't retain water, it's going to be washed off into those waterways, carrying along with it nitrogen, phosphorus, those nutrients that lead to algal blooms. So thinking about soil, and this kind of ties back into what I was saying with microbial communities and smaller arthropods and how they interact with food webs. So soil is the food for a lot of the microbes that exist in our areas, food for our plants. So as we think about our local ecosystems, it goes beyond birds and mammals and pollinators. It really starts with our soils, with our plants, and with our microbes. So it's incredibly important to think about the soil that we have and the amount of organic matter within it when we want to think about how we can support biodiversity. So here's an example of a root-feeding nematode. So a fungal hyphae that's ensnaring a root-feeding nematode to keep it from the root. So there's this kind of whole world of competition and mutualisms and ecological interactions that are occurring beneath the ground that we don't even think about. What was that?
Turf wars.
Oh, yes. Oh, man. The turf extension agents and professors like Brian Horgan and Sam Bauer, they're constantly in those kinds of battles. So soil microbe levels. So within different soil types, so different landforms, a forest, a prairie, a home lawn, a garden, etc., there's going to be kind of different levels of diversity, biodiversity that can exist within them. And I kind of want to show that from the bottom up. So in just 1 teaspoon of soil, when we think about bacteria, there's 100 million to 1 billion organisms, and that's whether you're in ag land, a prairie, or a forest. And based on how much of those lower levels of the lower trophic levels you're supporting, it's going to eventually dictate how much life you could support at higher trophic levels. So I know here we're only going as high as earthworms and insect arthropods, but this makes its way all the way up the food web to our pollinators, to our birds, to anything that feeds on an earthworm, anything that feeds on an insect. So it's really important that we're bringing in these really microbe-rich composts, these soils that are rich in organic matter, because it has consequences up and down our food chains. So a couple types of compost that organic Bob, so Bob Dahm, I mentioned him before, that he's really keen on. And if you have any further questions about these, I really recommend that you look at the information Blue Thumb has, or I believe Blue Thumb can put you in contact with Bob himself, as he's really an expert on all things soil, all things compost, but I could give you a little brief overview. So humified compost is humus-dense compost, and it's very microbe-rich. So that's kind of the common theme within these different types of compost that I'm going to discuss. And just 1/4 inch of humified compost is better than 3 inches of anaerobic compost. So we're thinking of an aerobic system versus anaerobic system. So an example of this is vermicompost, which is humified. And soil that is deep in mulch or a no-dig garden is also humified. So, what was that?
What's the other one?
Oh, so this would be it now.
Oh, sorry.
Oh wait, could you expand on your question maybe?
The aerobic and the anaerobic. So what's the anaerobic?
Oh, so there's a bunch of different types of anaerobic composts, but aerobic versus anaerobic, it's how the role that oxygen plays within the compost. So aerobic is with oxygen, anaerobic is without oxygen. So compost tea is another form of compost that Organic Bob is very keen on, and this compost is both aerated and aerobic. So it's a super high quality source of compost, and the fact that he's always driving into people is that it's super biodiversity. It's great for biodiversity, and it's because of how it interacts with microbe populations. So because it supports an incredibly rich microbe population, it makes its way up the food chain and is a great source for supporting biodiversity. It also can play a role in weed control and nutrient uptake, and it can improve the hydration of your lawn, so its ability to take in water. So here are some cover crops that Organic Bob likes to recommend for these kind of more alternative lawns. And the ones that I'm really a fan of are with those L next to it. So I know someone before when I was talking about clover mentioned that it's a nitrogen fixer. And all of those plants with the L next to it are legumes, which means they also fix nitrogen. So whether you want the benefits that are associated with the plant itself, or if you want to bring kind of the nitrogen and nutrients back to your yard, these legumes can be super helpful. So this is an example of a radish that was in a lawn that Organic Bob interacted with. And he got his seeding from Territorial Seed. He planted them in the fall. And once again, the reason that he loves these radishes is because of how they interact with microbes. So having these radishes present can really help support a microbe-rich community, which works its way up to worms, which are also super big fans of radishes. So when you think about aeration and removing the cores of soil from the ground, you're improving the way that water and nutrients, etc., can flow within the lawn. So these tillage radishes are kind of like an alternative way to deal with, to like aerate sort of, to break up compaction with the lawn and kind of improve the flow of nutrients, oxygen, etc. within your lawn. So now some different planting strategies that can help enhance the number of blooms that you see within a lawn if you choose to use some of these practices. So I'll talk about overseeding, new seedings, and sod. So here I'll talk about an overseeding shortcut. So a basic rule of thumb is if your lawn is generally healthy and doesn't have a bunch of creeping Charlie or other aggressive invasives, then this method is something that can work for you. So the first thing that you want to do is mow your lawn as short as possible. And this ties again back to that idea of seed to soil contact. So if you have tall turf grass and you try and overseed, so much of that seed is going to get caught up in the grass, never reach the soil bed, and never come to germinate. If you mow as low as you can, an inch if possible, you'll increase your seed to soil contact and have more blooms. In addition to this, you're going to want to rake your clippings to once again expose as much soil as possible. So here we are, we're mowing low so that we could drop seed in our lawn. Okay, so overseeding. We want to spread the seed. So some people like to just drop it by hand. What I normally like to do is use a drop spreader, and what that does is it makes sure I'm dropping an even amount of seed throughout the entirety of my lawn. So after seeding, and really before seeding as well, you really want to keep this ground moist because that's going to be the number one thing that your seeds are reacting to. It's going to be the first limiting factor that can kind of play a role in whether or not what you're putting into your lawn survives. So it's really important to keep these areas moist. And maintenance, so when you're putting in maybe bee lawn flowers or perennial ground cover, you might have to change your mowing practices at least a little bit. So most home lawns are mowed to 2 to 2.5 inches, following the rule of 1/3. And I guess I should explain what that is. So in turfgrass science, there's this general rule of thumb that you should never remove more than 1/3 of the turf grass. So maybe if you let your grass grow to 4.5 inches and cut it down to 3, but what we want to do here is never mow below 3 inches. So at a bare minimum, you want to go from 4.5 to 3 inches. What I like to do in the areas that I manage, so outside the bee lawn or my research sites, is I tend to recommend letting the grass grow to 6 inches and cutting it back to 4. So that's what works for bee lawn plantings. For other forms of ground cover, it might be a little different. So you want to be conscious of what works for the plants that you're putting into your yard. Okay, so now for seeding. So rather than doing an overseeding where you could just drop down seeds over the top of your grass, you also want to think about, what if I want to completely do things over? So what we recommend here is a complete vegetation removal and essentially turning over your soil. So what this does is it really reduces that compaction, and because now that you've really broken up your soil, you've completely inverted it, you're going to have that really desirable seed to soil contact ratio. So once again, you want to rake it and smooth it out, and also keep the water away from impervious surfaces. So what an impervious surface is, it's any type of land cover that can't absorb water. So the concrete here is an example. Anywhere where there's a building or a roadway is an impervious surface. So we really want to keep our water use restricted to lands that can take in water. So we want to sow the seed, and what we see covering the what has grass under it here, that little strip, is what's called a germination blanket. So it helps to retain moisture, hold your soil in place, hold your seeds in place as well. And all of these qualities will help to improve the germination of whatever you're putting down in your lawn. So sod. So these are options that are the first two options I mentioned with an overseeding or kind of the complete seeding renewal. They take a little bit more time, but they're a little more cost effective. Some people just want immediate results and they want to completely overhaul, essentially overnight. So what you can do is you can replace your sod. So there are some nurseries I know of, Rainbow Tree Care would be one of them, that are willing to install no-mow seed mixes as a sod. So typically it's Kentucky bluegrass that's available, which is a high maintenance species. But now we're starting to see more and more companies offer this for the fescues, tall fescue and fine fescue. So these are starting to become more available to homeowners in the greater Twin Cities area and really throughout the country as a general trend. So while it is a great kind of overnight solution, just be aware of the fact that especially when a sod installment is new, these can be really prone to damage from small mammals like a squirrel, like a raccoon, etc., anything that's going to dig through the soil. So just be careful of raccoons and squirrels kind of digging at your sod, at least in the beginning. So now the ongoing maintenance that's required for these different types of ground cover. So talking about issues related to mowing and also weeding. So as we mentioned before, you want to have a mower where the height is adjustable. So rather than mowing to that 2 to 2.5 inches that's kind of become the norm in most urban and suburban areas, we really want to raise that mowing height to at least 3 inches. And if you really want to make me and the constituents in my labs happy, even 4 inches would be preferable. But really as high as you're willing to go. So here we have an image of kind of a traditional lawn height, the 2.5 to 3 inches, versus something that we're looking to promote, a little bit of an alternative aesthetic at 4 inches, but something that can be really great for your ecosystems in terms of reducing the inputs associated with mowing. And if you're trying to have flowers grow, these taller growing heights will be beneficial for the flowers in your yard as well. So some issues with no-mow, and the first and most prominent is this, the issues with thatch. So thatch is dead plant material kind of at the intersection of where your grass is growing and the soil bed. So by reducing your mowing, you can have more thatch buildup. And what you want to do is there is a dethatching machine that's available to homeowners. So at around once per season, probably, so normally around now, maybe now because it's a little bit of a late winter, a few weeks from now, you just want to go through with a dethatching machine, kind of make sure you're starting in a fresh lawn that's not going to have too much dead plant matter in it, and that should reduce some of the issues that we see with a no-mow lawn. Oops, oh, there we go. So when we think about weed control, it's really important to, once again, go back to soil. So weedy plants are something that we always struggle to control, but we don't consider is that they're kind of a natural part of plant succession. So normally the way that we would get rid of weeds, or excuse me, that a land would get rid of weeds isn't by human intervention, it's through natural succession. So weeds and these low-growing herbs are typically colonizing plants. So when new area becomes available, whether it's through fire or grazing, it's these weeds and these low-growing plants that are the first to settle. Because with how we manage our land currently, we don't give the time for succession to take over, where things like grasses and shrubs and trees, etc., would eventually take the place of these weeds. It's kind of it presents kind of a new situation where for the first time, rather than letting nature control what grows, we're trying to manipulate that. So by mowing constantly, it can kind of dictate the plants that are able to grow. But if you're looking to promote plant life within your yard and you're okay with these weeds, which I prefer to think of as flowers, maybe you will be okay with raising that mowing height just a little bit, mowing less frequently, and allowing these flowers and weeds to flourish within your yard. So here's a quick list of resources that were used today to help present to this talk, and I'll give a little minute here because it looks like some people want to take these down. So Organic Bob is really great for whatever soil questions you might have, compost questions, etc. Blue Thumb and the landscape architects are experts on most things discussed today. For more turf or yard-specific questions, the Turfgrass Science Lab at the U of M and their extension agents like Sam Bauer do a really great job of interacting with homeowners on a one-on-one basis. And also some sites, websites, where you can look at different forms of yard cover and seed. Does everyone have what they needed there? Can I move forward? Okay, great. And finally, some references and sources of literature that helped make this presentation. And I'll give another few moments to anyone that wants to take a picture, write anything down. But at this moment, I can take some questions that anyone might have related to what I discussed today. In front. Oh, I guess in the middle, rather.
I've been planting Mega Minor with the beautiful, shiny, elliptical leaves and the gorgeous purple flowers in the spring. But this past year, I noticed for the first time, I've never ever seen a bee or any other type of insect flying around it. Does that mean that it's not a good pollinator? Or maybe the pollinators are coming and I'm not seeing them?
So it is possible that pollinators are visiting, but you aren't seeing them. So the ideal foraging time for a pollinator is a sunny day between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. I would say, if you're okay with a tighter window, maybe even like 11 and 3 p.m. But if you've been doing this for a few years and you haven't seen pollinators on it, it probably means that it's just not attractive to the pollinator. It's either it doesn't have the right floral shape, color, etc., scents even. So if you are okay with trying out some different types of forage, the ones I've mentioned here, or the Bee Lab has a whole list of different pollinator-friendly plants that we encourage homeowners to use. Those are all something that could be super helpful. And I just remembered that if you have a question, I encourage you to move up to the microphone over here so that everyone can hear your question. Yeah, in the green. And would you mind going over to the little podium? In fact, Reg?
We actually, yeah, we have a
Oh.
handheld too if you.
Oh, I apologize for that. I didn't realize the mic was coming over.
All right,
Thank you. So you talked about what to do if you have a healthy lawn with no creeping Charlie.
Yep.
Anyone? I have a huge lawn that I inherited that is full of creeping Charlie. So how do you handle that?
Okay, so this is a question that I've gotten so frequently that I've actually just went ahead and I wrote a little creeping Charlie fact sheet where it covers both maintenance and removal and how it interacts with pollinators. So there's two different creeping Charlie situations. The first one that you mentioned, where lawn covered with creeping Charlie, is a little bit more daunting. And unfortunately, what you're going to have to do there is creeping Charlie is so aggressive and so hardy where you kind of have no choice but to really do a complete lawn renovation. So I'm sorry, there's no easy solution there. And honestly, if I had one, I would be working. Yeah, I would have a fair bit of change in my pocket right now. But what I do have a little bit more hopeful information on is this. So does anyone have a situation where they have some creeping Charlie, but it hasn't completely overtaken their lawn? Okay, so there is some hope for you yet. So I can't go to each of you one at a time, but the trend here, what I would bet plenty of money on, what little I have, even though I haven't found the cure to creeping Charlie, is that your creeping Charlie started off in a shady area where there's a lot of moisture. And the reason for this is typically a place where the grasses or the vegetation that's common within a home yard can't survive. So if you have, let's say, a Kentucky bluegrass, which is the premier lawn grass in the northern climates, it's just flat out not going to survive in the face of dense shade. So what you want to do is you want to remove what creeping Charlie exists underneath a shaded area, whether it be by hand pulling, whether it be by an herbicide treatment. And if you put in a shade-tolerant plant underneath your trees or wherever there's shade for whatever reason, if you limit where creeping Charlie is first able to penetrate into, you'll also limit its ability to spread throughout your yard. So if you put in a fine fescue variety that's super well adapted to shade, it'll limit where the creeping Charlie is able to penetrate into your yard. If you put in some of those sedges that are super well adapted to shade, it'll leave nowhere for the creeping Charlie to kind of pioneer and trailblaze into, and therefore it won't be able to spread throughout your yard. Was that sufficient? Anyway.
Well, what is its pollinator?
Okay, so Minnesota has kind of the perfect analogy for how creeping Charlie works within a yard. So who here has ever played a scratch off, or at least knows what it is? A pull tab. Okay, you might be a little bit shy, but I am sure at least one of you has played it or knows what it is. So when you're wherever you are and you're doing these pull tabs, most of the time you're a loser, but every now and then you get that big winning pull tab, and it's like, ooh boy, that was exciting. I should come back and buy 500 more pull tabs. And creeping Charlie as a flower with its pollinators is kind of like the exact same way. So firstly, it doesn't produce any pollen, so there goes, half of the rewards. But with its nectar, it has this inconsistent reward pattern, just like a pull tab, where most of the time, the nectar that's produced is going to be very low in quality, and it's not really that boost of energy that pollinators are looking for. But eventually, you'll hit that big reward pull tab or flower where it's super high in nectar, and it tells the bees, this is very high quality forage. I should visit 500 creeping Charlie flowers, buy all the pull tabs I can find. And that is included in the fact sheet, so if you want some more kind of Oh yeah, I guess I should have included that. So it's on both the UMN Turf website and the University of Minnesota Yard and Garden blog. And honestly, I think if you Google Creeping Charlie Management or Creeping Charlie Management Minnesota, it should come up. Oh yeah, with the microphone.
Trying to be good. So you said an herbicide is an option. Are any of these sort of natural herbicides that you mentioned going to work on Creeping Charlie?
Gosh, I wish they would, but for Creeping Charlie, it's one of those situations where you kind of have to bite the bullet and use glyphosate.
Okay.
Yeah, or dig it out, but you have to do a really good job because boy, is it hardy and resilient.
So if you plant, let's say you dug it out and planted something in there, it's gonna take over what you planted, probably?
So you're saying if I were to dig out the Creeping Charlie and plant something in there? So if you do like an absolutely flawless bang-up job of removing the Creeping Charlie, then it is possible that you could plant something in place of it, especially something that's shade resistant. But it's just so resilient and so hardy where it's really difficult to remove all of the plant material, and if there's some left, it'll more likely than not come right back.
James, can you go back to the resources slide, just one back? There were still some people that were writing those down. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Laura.
Yeah.
Yep, so,
So-
in the yellow and then you.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment because I've had the slow grow fescue yard for about 10 years now. And
That's awesome.
I love the feel of it. You walk around barefoot. It's just really luxurious. I love the look of it. There are a couple problems with it though that nobody told me about. One is it's real hard sometimes to find a lawnmower that you can cut high enough for that, especially since it falls over. That's my experience has been, it's easier to take a weed whacker to it than it is to take a lawnmower. And I have a small lawn, so that works.
Can I give you a little bit word of advice on that?
Sure.
So I guess first, so this is going to vary on a homeowner to homeowner basis, but do you know what height it is that you normally start at and what height you're trying to go to when you do these mowings?
Well, I was told to cut it like 4 inches or so, and my lawnmower was not going to raise, the platform wasn't going to go up to 4 inches.
Okay, and do you know how tall it is before you mow?
Oh, it's about 6 inches.
So what can be useful? So from 6 to 4, it really is going to depend on the settings of your lawnmower and if it can amend to this. But in an instance where you're trying to remove some hardy fescue, it can be a lot easier if you do 2 passes where you remove half of your desired height at each interval. So I know that when I go from 4.5 to 3, I'll go from 4.5 to 3.5 in my first pass, and then from 3.5 down to 3 in my second pass. So you probably get the situation where the lawnmower is getting super clogged up. You have to restart it a bunch of times. So if you do 2 passes, even though it sounds like more work, it will save you time and energy in the long run.
Okay. So the other thing I wanted to mention is I have a lot of trees in my yard, and they all drop their leaves at different times. So if I don't get all of the leaves off of my fescue, it doesn't come back. It does not like to be covered up. So I didn't have a mulching lawnmower at the time, so I learned that lesson the hard way. So that's something to be aware of.
Okay, thank you. I believe we had one in front. Is that correct? A question?
This helped a lot, but is there a place to buy this no-mo sod?
Oh gosh, I don't know exactly who carries it, but Laura might.
Yeah.
So I don't know if they do it as sod. I know that they offer just like a bee lawn land care package, where So based on the research that we've done at the U of M, they've taken those practices and created a whole land care treatment based on it. So they'll do the scalping and aeration, seeding the proper flowers, etc. So I can't speak to how much it costs and how effectively they do it, because this is completely removed from work I do myself. But I know that they claim to follow our guidelines.
I will look into that a little bit more and just ask around.
It would be perfect.
Right, just to get a few sod rolls. Yeah,
And that's all we need.
yeah. So I'll ask around a little bit and we'll email all of you if I find anything.
Yes.
Is there trouble with other like ticks and things that would grow in the longer, finer grass, if you've got animals and?
I haven't come in contact with a tick issue in these grasses, and I've probably been in my fair share of fine fescue. But for more information on that, Sam Bauer could give a really good answer. But I don't know of ticks being an issue within fine fescues and longer grasses.
Okay, because we live right by the creek, and so we got tons of critters.
Okay, yeah.
Going through.
Yeah, so ticks that probably already exist near you, and whether or not they would use the longer grass as a resource. It's a situation that I haven't encountered, so I can't really speak to what would happen in that in what you're dealing with.
Thank you.
So I prefer to use a reel mower for my lawn, and I'm wondering if you know of one that will handle these taller grasses and these finer fescues, because I know the one I currently have wouldn't.
A reel mower that would handle these grasses?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know that one exists. That is going to be quite the daunting task. But if you think about it, the reason that we want to reduce mowing is mostly, or at least partially, to reduce the amount of fossil fuel output. So if you're using a reel mower and that's not an issue for you, I mean, unless you're trying to get some plants to grow that are very sensitive to height, you can mow away because you're not releasing any fossil fuels.
I guess it's not, I don't understand. I guess I'm trying to not just have a minimum amount of mowing, but also a minimum amount of care.
Oh, you're trying to minimize maintenance.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have to use my reel mower twice as often as a regular mower, because otherwise if it gets too tall, you can't mow.
Yeah, if you're trying to minimize maintenance, then a reel mower it's just not going to meet both needs. So you kind of have to weigh what you value more, the reducing input versus effort. So if you want to reduce effort, those electric mowers, those motorized lawn mowers are just going to outperform a reel mower pretty much every time.
All right, thank you.
So are there species though, James, like clover that wouldn't get that tall, that wouldn't necessarily need to be mowed?
Yeah, if you're thinking specifically about the bee lawns that I mentioned, so Dutch white clover blooms at as low as 2.5 inches. Prunella vulgaris blooms at as low as 2.5 or 3 inches, and creeping thyme as low as 2 inches. So, and then depending on what you're comfortable with, Calico Aster's a drop taller at 3.5 to 4. But each of the plants that I mentioned, especially for the bee lawn section where it's kind of, that's what my degree will be on, I have information out there about its bloom height, about what conditions it grows best under. But there are certainly plants that can bloom as low as 2.5 inches, certainly 3.5 inches.
There it is. So all of these different plants that you talked about, the fescues and sedges, some of them, are they all deep root or are they shallow root? And so if you're on a slope, is it going to be an erosion problem if it's not deep root?
So root depth definitely differs from species to species. So I know that the tall fescue grasses have a very deep root system, and it allows them to do well in the face of a slope. But a slope is a very difficult situation for a homeowner, any land care manager. So if that's an issue that you're facing with, that you deal with, I would recommend that you talk to a landscape architect at Blue Thumb, one of the extension agents at the university, because that's going to be a much more complex system, especially if it's a pretty steep slope than what your typical homeowner's dealing with.
All right, well, the last question here.
Okay, the sedges that you're talking about, is that the stuff that people put on like roofs for, you know, eco-friendly roofs? And if so, can you buy that in sod?
So I have no clue if it's available as sod. I would guess not. I would be pretty impressed if someone had sedge sod. That would be pretty cool, actually. But there's a whole variety of plants that go into green roofs. I've seen turf grass where people are thinking, you know, get as much oxygen output as possible, generally low input turf grass. I've seen entire clover beds that are bulbs, flower beds installed as green roofs. So there's all different types of green eco roofs out there.
Okay, well, thank you guys very much for coming. There are some pens and pencils over here if you need one to fill out your evaluation, and then if you can just drop your evaluations on the registration table as you leave. And thank you, James. That was a great presentation.
Oh, thank you.